All right, this is our chapter 5 reading of Animal Farm. So as winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. So we have Molly here, who's becoming more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. So was she really feeling bad? No. Molly was trying to get out of work. Was trying to get out of work. Again, Molly's representing the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, the rich. She's trying to get out of this. On every kind of pretext, she would run away from work and go to the drinking pool, where she would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. But there were also rumors of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely into the yard, so as she strolled kind of slowly and not paying attention, flirting her long tail and chewing at a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. "Molly," she said. So Clover is the female workhorse. She says, Molly, she said, "I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men were standing on the other side of the hedge, and I was a long way away, but I am almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you, and you are allowing him to stroke your nose. What does that mean, Molly?" So we see that Mr. Pilkington, who is on the other farm, who we discussed represents Great Britain in this allegorical analysis, is kind of petting and kind of talking to Molly. And Clover's very curious what's going on here. "He didn't. I wasn't. It isn't true," cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. "Molly, look at me in the face. Do you give me your word of honor that that man was not stroking your nose?" "It isn't true," repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face, and the next moment she took her heels and galloped away into the field. So this temptation of Molly by Mr. Pilkington is kind of and her denying it is showing how the wealthy of Russia, or the now Soviet Union, who had lost everything, wanted out. However, did they say anything? No. Stayed quiet out of fear. So they stayed quiet out of fear. Didn't want to get caught. Was afraid of being ousted. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw was a little pile of lump sugar and several bunches of ribbons of different colors. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that they had seen her on the other side of Willingdon. She was between the shafts of a smart dog cart painted red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man in check breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon round her forelock. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeon said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. So Molly has escaped Animal Farm. And if we're looking at the Soviet Union, others like Molly that would have been part of the bourgeoisie or had the ability would be attempting to, some successful, some unsuccessful, to escape from communist Russia, the Soviet Union. In January, there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were magnificently cleverer than the other animals, should decide all questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority. So now the decisions are being made. Come to accept that the pigs were manifestly cleverer than the other animals and should decide all questions. So the pigs have all power. And this is showing the shift when things got harder in the Soviet Union, when things got tough. The Communist Party, the communist leaders began to make the decisions because things were getting harder to produce goods and trying to get all of the proletariat to take control just wasn't being very efficient. Though the decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote, this arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the dispute between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point. Their disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage with barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats. And if one of them said that such and such a field was just right for cabbages, then the other would declare it was useless for anything except roots. Each had his own following, and there were some violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches. So again, we see Snowball is this brilliant speaker, and he's winning over the crowd. But Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. So he could kind of go out and get support in between whenever he wasn't face-to-face with the people. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, the sheep had taken to bleating, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meetings with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at a crucial moment in Snowball's speech. So Napoleon is using the sheep to disrupt Snowball. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the farmer and stock breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans for innovations and improvements. He talked learnedly about field drains, silage, and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for all the animals to drop their dung directly in the fields at a different spot every day to save labor of cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that snowballs would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. But of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. So the windmill is on your character or your allegory chart, so make sure you're paying attention to this part. So in the long pasture, not far from the farm building, there was a small knoll, which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. So essentially, this was like a little power plant that they could use for the farm. This would light the stalls and warm them in winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mango slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery. And they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work with them while they grazed at their ease in the fields or improved their minds with reading and conversation. So Snowball had a great plan to improve the farm. Within a week, Snowball's plan for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which belonged to Mr. Jones: 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing on. He was closeted there for hours at a time, with his books held open by a stone, with a piece of chalk gripped between his knuckles of his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing in lines after lines and uttering little whispers of excitement. Gradually, the plans grew into a complicated mass of cracks and cogs and wheels, covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible, but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were at pains not to tread on chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plans, and snuffed at them once or twice, then stood a little while contemplating them out of the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. So Napoleon lifts his leg, urinates, pees all over the plans, and walks out without uttering a word. Okay, so this is, Snowball lays out a great plan, and the animals are really liking it. And then Napoleon strikes back, okay, and he pees all over the plains, okay, urinates all over the plains. This is a great allegory to the Soviet Union because Stalin was not a great idea leader, okay? Trotsky was. He was a writer, a philosopher. He had plans and was writing novels about how, and speaking about how the Soviet Union and communism would spread throughout the world, and his plan to make the Soviet Union a greater place with including the world and reaching out to others throughout the world. Stalin, on the other hand, did not have these plans, okay? And he began to kind of behind the scenes start to reference Trotsky as a soft-hearted. He wanted to bring in capitalist ideas and some of these other things. We'll see how that kind of starts strolling up in a little bit. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be carried and built up into a wall. Then the cells would have to be made, and after that there would need to be dynamos and cables. How these were to be produced, Snowball did not say, but he maintained that it could all be done in a year, and thereafter he declared so much labor would be saved that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production. Okay, so Napoleon and Snowball, of course, are at odds here. Okay, Snowball is saying work hard now. It will be easy later. While Napoleon is saying continue to work hard. This is a dream that he has. Don't pay attention to him. Okay? So it said, we need to work on increasing the food production, and that if they wasted time on the windmill, they would all starve to death. The animals formed themselves into two factions under the slogan "Vote for Snowball" and the 3-day work and the 3-day week, or "Vote for Napoleon, the full manager." Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe either that food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it had always gone on. That is, badly. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was a question of the defense of the farm. It was fully realized that though the human beings had been defeated at the Battle of the Cowshed, they might make another and more determined attempt to recapture farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals of neighboring farms more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was to produce firearms and train themselves in the use of them. So, Napoleon is making a move So, as usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. So, Napoleon, what the animals must do is procure firearms and train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they would be bound to be conquered, and the other argued that the rebellions happened everywhere. They would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon, then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. So the animals always just agreed with whoever they were listening to in that moment because they weren't educated. They didn't know, okay? So Napoleon, I'm going to just put Nap. Napoleon wanted to arm Animal Farm to defend it. So Napoleon wanted to arm Animal Farm and defend it while Snowball, and I'm just going to put Snowball wanted to spread animalism and revolution. Animalism, revolution. And he believed that this would protect it. This is a great allegorical connection to Stalin and Trotsky again, because Trotsky wanted to spread communism around the world and for the whole world to have a revolution, while Stalin wanted for the Soviet Union to become a superpower and not to worry about spreading the word of revolution, but to just focus on the Soviet Union becoming a superpower that could defend itself and be powerful enough to go up against the world. At last, the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was to be put to the vote. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up, and though occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, set forth his reason for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense and that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds and seemed almost indifferent to the effect he produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet and shouted down the sheep, who had began bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal for favor of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been about equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be when the sordid labor was lifted from the animals' backs. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate thrashing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, and reapers and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water, and electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just as this moment, Napoleon stood up, and casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper, a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. So, up to this point, Snowball has convinced the animals. Okay? He has convinced the animals that this is the way to go, this is the plan. But, out of nowhere, Napoleon makes this high screeching sound that no one's ever heard him utter before. At this, there was a terrible bang sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. So those dogs that earlier in the book Napoleon had taken under his wing, so these enormous dogs, those little puppies he had taken before, he has been grooming them and growing them and training them. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running only as a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly he slipped, and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put on an extra spurt, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. So Snowball is attacked, but escapes. Okay, so he's attacked, but he escaped. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. So these are the puppies that Napoleon had reared privately. Though not yet full grown, they were huge dogs and as fierce looking as wolves. They kept Napoleon close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to do for Mr. Jones. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted on to the raised portion of the floor where Major had previously stood to deliver his speech. He announced that from now on the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In future, all questions related to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs, presided over by himself. These would meet in private and afterwards communicate their decision to the others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday morning to salute the flag, sing Beast of England, and receive their orders for the week, but there would be no more debates. So this is where Napoleon takes power. So I'm going to put Napoleon takes power of the farm. And he's using his dogs, the fearsome dogs, his secret police, allegorically connected, the KGB, as his powerhouse. In spite of the shock that Snowball expulsion had given them, the animals were dismayed by this announcement. Several of them would have protested if they had found the right arguments. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. So even Boxer was worried by this. He set his ears back, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. He set back his ears, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. But in the end, he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval. So we see some of the pigs just disapproving, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began squeaking at once. But suddenly the dogs sitting around Napoleon let out a deep, menacing growl, and the pigs fell silent and sat down again. Then the sheep broke out into a tremendous bleating, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. So the dogs will equal the KGB, which we'll talk about later, okay, the secret police, this fearsome, terrifying group, okay? Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangement to others. Comrades, he said, I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labor upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. So he's going to send Squealer, who is representing his propaganda, around to kind of bullhorn and announce to everyone that this is how we should feel. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, who as we now know, was no better than a criminal. So they start painting Snowball as a criminal. Propaganda that Snowball is a criminal. Okay, which we know isn't true. He fought bravely at the Battle of Cowshed, said somebody. Bravery is not enough, said Squealer. Loyalty and obedience are what are more important. And as to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come when we shall find that Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades, iron discipline. That is the watchword for today. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back. So again, this threat of Mr. Jones coming back. Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly, the animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday morning was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced the general feelings by saying, if Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right. And from then on, he adopted the maxim, Napoleon is always right. So Boxer, this working class citizen or animal of the farm, is representing this idea that Napoleon or Stalin is always right, in addition to his private motto, I will work harder. By this time, the weather had broken and the spring plowing had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up, and was assumed that the plans had been rubbed off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the animals assembled in the barn to receive their orders for the week. So no more choice for the animals, okay? Receive their orders for the week. The skull of Old Major, now clean of flesh, had been disinterred from the orchard and set up on a stump at the foot of the flagstaff beside the gun. After the hoisting of the flag, the animals were required to file past the school in a reverent manner before entering the barn. Nowadays, they did not sit all together as they had done in the past. Napoleon with Squealer and other pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for composing songs and poems, sat on the front of the raised platform with the 9 young dogs. These 9 young dogs forming a semicircle around them, sitting behind, and the other pig sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week in a gruff, solidary style. And after a single singing of Beast of England, all the animals dispersed. On the third Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. So now he's going to turn around and build the windmill after all. He did not give any reason for having changed his mind, but merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work. It might even be necessary to reduce their rations. So now there's a reason to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had all been prepared down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill, with various other improvements, was expected to take 2 years. So Stalin has a 5-year plan that is kind of the allegorical comparison to this, to rebuild the Soviet Union and modernize it. That evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it in the beginning, which we know is a complete and utter lie. And the plan which Snowball had drawn on the floor of the incubator sheds had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. That, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill simply as a maneuver to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plan could go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated a number of times, "Tactics, comrades, tactics," skipping around and whisking his tail with a merry laugh. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly that they accepted his explanation without further question. So we're going to see Squealer here use his propaganda to turn the animals against Snowball and give credit to Napoleon. Okay, so we see this big change in what is happening, okay, and we see this horrible move by Napoleon to steal Snowball's idea. So that ends chapter 5. Head over and update your character chart, the allegory character chart, and we'll keep going from there. Excellent.